So, it's July, and you're not getting your money's worth tonight since we're already on the 8th of July.
I heard that SoulFood was giving everybody a 30% rebate on their entry fee tonight because the month is nearly a third over.
Right, but it's kind of interesting that this morning was the new moon. So even though it's the 8th of July, this does begin a new monthly cycle.
Right, and this new moon is really an interesting new moon for a lot of reasons. Actually, this whole month is, as I looked at the month, it's a special month. And in some ways, last month, when I was here without Jeff, I talked a bit about this magical grand trine pattern that began last month, and that will become at least part of our theme for this evening, I'm sure.
Yeah, and that theme is really a watery theme. We begin the month for the first 3 weeks with the sun in the water sign of Cancer. And water signs, Cancer, Scorpio, and Pisces, are signs of feeling, signs of emotion that have little to do with logic in the ordinary sense, nor rationality, nor objectivity.
Or action, for that matter.
Well, that's your version of Cancer. Mine's a little more active than yours, I think. But there is that idea that the great gifts of this month will probably come in the quiet moments.
Well, let's put it this way. The action of water is often, or is best defined by its container or its relative position to gravity. So that water, basically, it can be active. It certainly can be active if anyone's ever whitewater canoed or stood under a waterfall. Water can be very active, but its action is defined by its response to the environment.
And I think that's where the information is for us this month, in our ability to listen and to respond on the inside. This store has lots of books in it. There's books all over the place. There's lots of written material online. There are lecturers standing up in front of you talking, all of which are sources of information. But the information that's most valuable this month is the kind that doesn't come in the form of words. It comes in feelings, it comes in music, it comes in touch, it comes through the other senses. So I think, and there are other reasons that Rick and I will talk about for this, but probably the best way to learn, and to learn the most valuable lessons this month, is simply to be quiet and listen. Now this is reinforced in another way, because Mercury, which is the talky, chatty communication planet, is going backwards right now.
And also in that same water sign of Cancer where the new moon was this morning. Yeah, if you look at where the planets are now, and for those of you who are not well versed in astrology, this wheel simply has the location of all the planets relative to the signs and relative to each other. And so we have Jupiter at 2 degrees just early in Cancer, and the sun and the moon, because it was a new moon today, are at the same degree in Cancer, and Mercury, as Jeff said, retrograde, we'll come back to that in a moment, is also in Cancer. In fact, in a few days, Mars will be in Cancer too, and we have Saturn, a slower moving planet that spends a couple of years or so in each sign. It's in Scorpio, another water sign, also feeling. And we have Neptune, and for those of you who care, Chiron, which is kind of an almost planet. But Neptune, which spends 14 years in a sign, in Pisces, also a water sign. And so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, soon to be 7 planets in water signs now. And that really is the backbone of what you were saying of all this kind of feeling, nonverbal energy. And when we look for verbal analysis, we look at Mercury. Mercury in Cancer doesn't say much anyhow, because it's in that receptive feeling kind of mode of pulling in energy. And 3 times a year, Mercury turns retrograde. It turned retrograde, which means it looks like it's going backwards from Earth's point of view. It turned retrograde on June 26th. It turns direct on July 20th. So most of this month is spent with that mental, intellectual communication function still covering old territory. And in fact, even when Mercury turns direct on July 20th, it's not until August 3rd that it gets past where it was when it turned backwards, meaning that we're still covering familiar ground.
Yeah, the common sort of understanding of Mercury retrograde is difficulty in communication, transportation, details, and technology. Mercury is associated in different ways with all of these functions. And because of that, Mercury retrograde has taken on sort of a negative tonality. And that is, oh, it's a bad time because more mistakes are likely to happen. Now, whether that's true or not, I think is going to vary according to the individual. But I think the point of Mercury retrograde, of the planet of intellect and perception going backwards, is to rethink and review. This is particularly true in Cancer, which, as Rick talked about, is a sign that is, although it's a cardinal season-starting sign which is meant to go forward, it's a little reluctant to do so.
Well, if you think about Cancer is just Latin for crab, and crabs have these big appendages, these claws that are in front of them, and when a crab really wants to move, when it really wants to get going, if it wants to aggress and go somewhere new, it turns around and runs like hell backwards, because that way the claws that don't get in the way. And so this idea of Cancer really, it does in some ways, it's like the tunnel spider that sets its trap by building its web and then just waiting at the mouth of the web, waiting for something to get caught in it. And there's that sense with Cancer, that kind of passiveness. In fact, when Mars goes into Cancer next week, we'll talk a little bit about the passive aggressiveness of that Mars in Cancer.
Yeah, and I think this notion and this idea of Cancer being passive is critical. It's critical because if we believe that, or we allow that to be the end of the story, and there's a difference between tendencies, just as we have in our personalities or as signs have, and what we choose to go forward with. Part of the purpose of studying astrology is to understand your tendencies so that you're not limited by them, so you can use them desirably and appropriately, but move away from them when you recognize they're unconscious habits that inhibit growth. And Cancer is a sign of history, of personal memory and history. So there's a lot of backward looking, just as Rick talked about that crab going back end first. There is a collective tendency in the sign of Cancer, and I think in emotions in general, for us to refer to the past as if it were the determining factor as to what's going to happen in the future. And while clearly the past, personal history, has an enormous role to play in our psychological development and our life experiences and the decisions that we make, today's a new moon in Cancer. And new moons, even in backward-looking signs, are reminders to live in the present and turn forward. This reminds me of a line I'll misquote from Tom Robbins, one of Rick's favorite writers, who Rick quoted, which is, I think, you're never too old to have a happy childhood.
It's never too late to have a happy childhood. It's the closing line in Still Life with Woodpecker.
Which means that it's never too late to gain a deeper understanding and to untangle some of the painful knots of self-limitation and suffering of your early life experiences. You don't erase the events, but the interpretation and the function that they play in our lives can change.
And Tom Robbins is a Cancer.
There you go.
Yeah, that whole idea of going forward but looking back, what you call the personal history, there's that sense of we are nurtured by our personal nostalgias. You know, it's like there are these are the good old days, a Cancerian song. You know, the good old days of summer. This is the summertime now. That sense, I thought as you were talking, there was a Marshall McLuhan who is a media guru in the 60s and early 70s, who used to talk about something he called rear view mirrorism. Driving ahead by looking in the rear view mirror. That's what crabs or cancers often do. But coming back to this thing of passiveness, passiveness is not to be confused with inaction, because one can appear to be not in control. I think of Ross Perot, who was a Cancer, who said, for those of you who might remember, he was the non-candidate for president who was invisible and said, I'm not really here, I'm only here because of you. Meanwhile, he was the puppet master manipulating the whole show. And I think that Cancerian energy can be very proactive in subtle ways that make it look like they're not doing anything, but in fact there can be a tremendous amount of control and passion for your own good. I'm manipulating this because I love you and this is for you. It's the overprotective parent can be the Cancer or Cancerian mother, the image of the Jewish mother, that idea of so much protectivity that you have nowhere to move, but it's not that they're passive, it's that they're nurturing too much.
And nurturing in a controlling way. So today, with the new moon in Cancer, this is a good time to ask ourselves, what beliefs do we hold about ourselves that are rooted in the past that inhibit our goals for the future? When Rick talked about this idea of looking backwards, it's understandable. I look backwards because that's how I knew who I am. If I just showed up here with a blank slate of a mind, I wouldn't know who I am. And yet, the job with all of these planets in Cancer, I think, is to revisit the past, but to revisit it as your present self, not as the wounded child, the abandoned woman, the victimized man. Whatever it is that you identify with, I think it's helpful to go back to it, to revisit it, to hang out with it, not necessarily to force yourself to try to fix it, because that's anti-Cancerian, but to allow yourself to be in a less certain place, a place of less certitude about the impact of your divorce, or that failing grade that you got, or that limp that you have that ruined your career as a track star.
Don't you think, actually I'm pretty sure you do think, that tendency to hold on to the past from Cancer is really about a need for security, for safety. And it's like, it worked for me before, it'll work for me now. Cancerian energy is said to be very loyal and tenacious because it does hold on to things that are important. There's a family values concept around the Cancerian energy. In fact, our Cancerian holiday is Independence Day, which is odd. But what do we do on Independence Day? It's in July, the sun's in Cancer. We get together with our family, we hang out by the edge of a body of water, whether it's a swimming pool or a lake or the seaside, and we eat food, we nurture. I mean, yes, we're celebrating independence, but it's kind of like there's that whole sense in Cancer of nurturing that's very, very important.
Yeah, and what nurturing does and what family does, whether it's your biological family, your soul food tribe, your collection of Pisces girlfriends, whatever it might be, take a look at what binds you to a group and ask yourself if that binding quality is, again, serving your contemporary needs. Because part of psychological growth includes the necessity of rejecting family values. Now, that doesn't mean you don't reclaim those family values, but rejecting them is a necessary step in becoming an individual who then can freely choose to pick up and continue some of the values of the family, but who does it as a matter of conscious choice rather than unconscious habit pattern.